All right, welcome back, y'all. So today we're going to be working on assemblies. This is going to be based off of the previous video we had, where we learned about how CAD works, how extrusions work, and sketches work. So today I'm going to be explaining what assemblies are, first of all, and then we'll go into using them and making a couple arbitrary models with them and learning the main features. Before that, if you want a little bit more practice on our previous lectures, so about extrusions and just the basics of SolidWorks, feel free to look on our website. You'll find a few practices. I'll link that to the bottom of this video. So feel free to replicate that. And that's going to give you a good practice and it'll get you a lot more comfortable with the SolidWorks platform. But for today, we're going to be focusing on, like I said, assemblies. First of all, what are assemblies? When we start a new file, we see three options, but don't worry about the drawings right now. We have these two main options, parts and assemblies. Parts are what we did last time, a 3D model of a singular component. So whether that be the tube stock or the gusset, those are both singular items. So when you would construct them in real life, they would just be one piece. Whereas an assembly is something you combine items together to build a joint system. So for example, our drivetrain is an assembly. This piece I have open right here, this is an assembly. It has these gussets on top of these pieces of tube stock right there. So it has multiple different parts connected to each other. An assembly can also be connecting multiple other assemblies. So for example, if I wanted, I could replicate this and attach it to itself, and that would still be called an assembly. And the point basically of an assembly is just to connect various parts or assemblies into another system. So this is the piece that we're going to be making today. It's an arbitrary piece that I just came up with. It's not something we would ever realistically make, but it goes over all of the basic ideas about assemblies that we need to know for today. So this is what it looks like. It's just two gussets connected by two pieces of tube stock, and then the gussets are also on the back sides of the tube stock. And then it also has this third rectangular gusset. And yeah, that's all the piece for today. Let's go over how to make it. So first, let's create a new file. This time we are going to be working on an assembly file rather than a part. The interface of an assembly looks pretty similar. What you'll see when you create the file is it gives you this pop-up of begin assembly. What it's asking you to do basically is add a part that you want to use as a part of your assembly. So for example, I want my piece of tube stock. So I'll take that piece of tube stock and put that down. Notice how that closes the window. So every time when you go into your assembly, it will close your window once you place a part. So what you can do instead is go into insert components. So this insert components button here is what you're going to use to add any part or assembly into your current working assembly. So click insert components and then click this pin. What this does is it keeps the menu open until you're done. So I want to add this piece of tube stock because I wanted two. And then I also want my gusset. So I'm going to go into this browse menu. This gives me a pop-up of my files. So I'm going to go into downloads and try to find my L gusset. So right there, open that. I want two of those. So put that down. You might be wondering why I'm only taking two of them. You'll see why in a minute. What I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you how to just copy paste these to the other side. Since if you look at our initial model, both of these are on the same side, so are identical in their placement, other than the fact that they're just on the opposite side of the tube stock. So rather than having to do all of the attaching again, I'll teach you how to make it so that you can just copy and paste them over to the other side through a feature called mirror. But first, let's figure out how assemblies work. So there's 2 to 3 main things in assembly. They're called mates. So you can see the mirror, window for it right here. So that's the tool. If you click that, it'll open this window. The two main types of mates that you have to worry about right now are coincidence and concentrics. Coincident mates, what those do is they take a plane of your part and they attach it to the plane of another part. So for example, if I wanted to attach both these pieces of tube stock, I could coincident mate their top faces and their ends. And now what's happened is that this tube stock can only move in this direction. Why? Since these two mates are attached, it can't move. These planes are now attached. So when you select this face and this face, instead of actually attaching those two faces, what it does is it attaches the full plane of those faces. So it can now move across that plane. Oh, and that plane itself can't move. So like everything else can move across that plane. But since these two the planes are fixed together, nothing can move there. Since we attach this face and this face as well, this can no longer move in the direction of this line. So it can't move there and back. Rather, it can just move forward and back since there currently isn't anything that's restricting these faces. And that's good because now we'll learn about our second type of mate, which is concentric. That's what we're going to be using to attach these two together with these gussets. So since the gussets have holes for screws, those are what we use to align the gusset. So for our placement, we want that hole to be aligned with that hole. So what I can do is I can select the inside of this hole and the inside of that hole. And since it has two circular components, it's automatically going to consider that a concentric mate. So that's how I want that. And I can click the green check mark. Then I want the center of this hole to be attached to the center of this hole. So I can also select that. And finally, I want the center of this hole to be attached to the center of this hole on the gusset. It already looks like it is, but because of how the tube stock is placed, this can change. So we always want to have as many restraints as possible without over restraining it. So at the same time, you want to keep it to a minimum. Like, don't overdo your restraints because, like always, we want to keep everything as simple as possible. But make sure you have enough so that your part is completely defined. Now you can notice that this gusset is currently through. Since the only kind of mates we've applied so far are concentric mates, the gusset is now tied to all of those holes. The way a concentric mate works is instead of attaching planes, what it attaches are axes. So for these cylindrical holes, their central axis is what's bound to the central axis of this cylindrical hole. So consider a line going through all the way here, or like a piece of string through all three of these holes. And that's what's holding it together. Since it's on a piece of string, though, it can move up and down because there's nothing like gluing this down. So to glue it down now, what we can do is we can use our mate that we learned earlier, the coincident. We can select this side and the bottom of our gusset and coincident mate them together. So the coincident mate works somewhat like glue. It will attach the part on top of the other. Now we can replicate the same thing on this side. So we take this piece, that hole to that hole, that hole to that hole, and that hole to that. So now that all of our holes are defined, what we can do is attach this on top like we did previously. And there we go. So what you just did there is you learned about two of the most important types of mates that we will use. The coincident mate, which attaches things on top of each other and it connects the planes of two different parts. And the concentric mate, which attaches the central axis of each part. So now that that's done, let's think about how to replicate this part onto the other side and how to create that gusset I had in the middle. Since I want to create a new part that specifically uses the context of this assembly, so for example, I want to make the gusset that uses the hole and the placement on this assembly, right? If I went into a new part, I would have to find the dimension of where something ends and where something starts. I'd have to copy that into a new part file and worry about that. But instead, what we can do to avoid that and to be able to just make it in the context of this assembly, if I go to this Insert Components button and right under it, if I click this arrow and click New Part, what that does is it creates a part that's inside this assembly. So it's a new part that you can just create within the assembly, and it registers that as a separate piece. So we want to make a gusset on this piece. So this is identical to how we would make any part. We select a face and then just keep a sketch there, make our piece, and extrude it. So I'm just going to give this any random dimensions. It doesn't actually matter what this looks like. The point is understanding how it works. So there we have our rectangle. And another feature that you guys should know is this convert entities. Since those holes are on a different piece, if I try to extrude this, the holes won't actually be a part of this sketch, and hence this would just extrude as a complete rectangle. So instead, what I can do is I can use the convert entities tools, select those holes. What that's going to do is it's going to copy the holes over from that part onto our sketch. So instead of having to redraw 10 of these holes, we can just select them, convert entities, and there we go. We have all of our holes placed. Let's complete dimensioning this part. 5 inches. There we go. The part's completely dimensioned. Now let's go into filleting it. For anyone who doesn't remember, we fillet our part so that it is easily manufacturable by our CNC. There we go. Now, while staying inside edit component, we should leave our sketch. And that's going to deselect our sketch. So the component we're currently editing is always going to be highlighted in blue. So click the drop down of that component, select the sketch, go into features, go into extrude. Like usual, we're just going to extrude our piece. For this one, I'll make it 0.09 inches. And there we go. We've made that gusset in the context of the assembly. So now we can leave the edit component. Great. So now that we've created all of our parts, and we've created this new part specifically in the context of this assembly, let's think about how we were going to save this part. We have two options. SolidWorks provides us two. Only one of them is really a viable option for the way we work on this team. The first option is to save within the context of this assembly. So what that does is it just saves this file into the file of the assembly rather than as a separate part file. We do not want that just because of how we organize our files. We'll go over that later. But just for now, for reference, what we have to do is we have to go to Control S. Gonna give us this pop-up, accept it. Call the part whatever you want. I'm just gonna call it Assembly Tutorial 1. Now here is the important step. Rather than saving it with in-context references, we want to save it without in-context references. So click that. And then click Save Externally. This is one of the most important parts about when you're making an assembly. Make sure to save externally. Once done, just click OK. And now the part is saved as a separate part outside of the assembly as well. So now we have all of the pieces we need on this side, but this side's completely empty. We can fix that easily. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a mirror feature. If we want to copy and paste this across here, though, we have to find a central part that it pastes across. So what we use for that is a plane. So we can select a plane there. Since we want the plane to be in the middle of this side and this side, we can select both of those sides. And SolidWorks, being as smart as it is, it goes directly to the middle of those two planes and creates another plane right in the middle for us. So this is exactly where we want our plane. Then what we can do is use the mirror components feature. So click the mirror components. Click the specific parts that we need. And since the plane is already selected, that works. And then we just have to click this check mark. Now we have this saved on to both sides. And just save our part. And there we go. We've learned the basics of assemblies. Congratulations. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. See you guys next time.